Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, our off-season preview is here. We go through who should stay, who should go, trade ideas, and of course, this crazy free agent market. We also answer your mailbag questions. So subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your shows. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today and subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. If you'd like to drop us a review, drop us a mailbag question with that review. Watch us on YouTube and also ask mailbag questions in the comments under the show there as well. Our off-season preview is here. We will cover all areas of the team, and the mailbag remains open, not just at the end of the show, but during the entirety of this episode. So during each segment, we'll hit your related questions. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. And Joe, we had a lot of fun this season covering this Mets team, but there is something different about the Mets Pod when the offseason starts, whether it's the hot stove, it's the winter meetings, all the coverage, the trade rumors, the trades that come out of nowhere, how long the MLB offseason is. I'm so excited, man.
As the kids say, this is when we cook, Connor. The offseason is when the Mets Pod it really gets going. I love breaking down the actual baseball games, but just inside of me at my core, I am much more interested in the team building aspect of it. So the offseason is fun, and this offseason is going to be especially fun. We kind of knew last offseason how the Mets were going to generally approach it, right? Like last year it was, they're going to pursue Yoshinobu Yamamoto. They may get him, they may not. And if not, it's just going to be kind of a modest offseason. And that's what ended up being. And it led to obviously fantastic results in the 2024 season. But now, with $180 million coming off the payroll and as much payroll flexibility as I think this team has had in, I don't even know how long, the options, as David Stern said, are endless. We have access to every player in the universe. Whatever they want, they can at minimum consider, and that's very exciting.
And before you bring in new fancy furniture or make some renovations on the house, you got to decide what should stay. And the Mets have a pretty long list of pending free agents, some different varying degrees of interest, of course, or impact or, current status with the team. But Joe, we'll rip through these pretty quickly, and at the end, we'll get through the larger conversation so we could be tighter on some of these. DJ Stewart is first on the list, once thought of as a depth bat that can provide you a lefty and hopefully get on base and hit for some power. It feels like that kind of ran its course and answered its own question during the season rather than up until now.
Yeah, DJ Stewart, he had his run that he did in 2022 or 23, whatever. And, that kind of, I'm not happy about it. I'm just going to,
I was going to say, it's such a sore spot because they won too many games.
I was going to say I'll never forgive him, but that feels really mean. But ultimately, I think DJ Stewart, I think now's the time to move on. And that's a bit of a non-tender. So he's an arbitration eligible player, not a true free agent. I think he's someone that the Mets will non-tender.
How about Harrison Bader, Joe? Because Bader was an interesting one-year deal that gave them elite center field defense. Ironically, for the first 2 months of the season, it felt like he had some of the biggest hits for the Mets when they were really struggling in clutch spots. The bat, unfortunately, fell off a cliff down the stretch run, and so did his playing time with the emergence of Tyrone Taylor. To me, Joe, Bader feels like, hey, loved having you. Really good energy around the team. You definitely served a purpose on this roster, but there's probably no need to rerun that experiment.
I think the Mets are going to have to do a repeat version of Harrison Bader, and we'll get into maybe a candidate or two for that later in the show. But I think, to your point, Connor, Harrison Bader, probably time to just find a different version of him. At this point, he likely is behind Tyrone Taylor on the depth chart. So time for a new face in center field as the Mets move forward.
Which is a good thing for the Mets because Taylor was already on the roster and is a really cheap option for them rather than having to go out and maybe commit not only multi-years to center field, which they don't want to do, but double-digit millions. This is the most interesting one we've brought up yet, Joe. Jesse Winker. A lot of Mets fans want him back. He was a really key left-handed bat as mainly a DH, more so than a corner outfielder. When things fell off a cliff for JD Martinez, Winker lifted the Mets up in a lot of big spots. He seemed to kind of embrace the playoff atmosphere. He definitely embraced this fan base, and it was reciprocated. Winker, to me, Joe, is interesting because I'm not on he's got to be back no matter what. I think the Mets have enough depth and options that it's not a, colossal failure if he ends up going somewhere. This was a guy, and credit to Jesse Winker, he was playing for his career with the Nationals this year after a really rough go of it in recent seasons. He kind of had a rebirth. He got traded at the deadline to a contender in the Mets. He made the most of his opportunity with the Mets. This would have to be a number, Joe, on a one-year deal that would make sense for both sides. If Jesse Winker, and good for him if he does, gets multi-year offers elsewhere, I wouldn't expect this one to happen.
I'd agree there. I want him back. I think he's a good fit. I think he's a good fit in this city. I think he's a good fit in this clubhouse, in this locker room. And you kind of always need the bad boy a little bit in the locker room.
The Mets needed this. I thought the Mets were... Yeah. I don't want to... They weren't a soft team. That's not fair. I think the Mets, they needed a little sandpaper to this team after how many times they were hit by pitches or run over the last couple of years. I thought it gave them a villain that they desperately needed.
Ultimately, at this point, I think Jesse Winker is probably more of a DH type of player. Teams aren't overly comfortable with him in the outfield at this stage in the game. He can go out there, but you don't really want him there. So I think this is something you just kind of see how the market goes. There's bigger priorities. But if you circle back around in January and you want to sign Jesse Winker back to be a part of a DH platoon, or however you want to kind of utilize him, I think he'd be a good fit to come back if it's a one-year deal.
Winker is an absolute trickle effect guy. What the Mets do with guys like Juan Soto, we'll talk about him on this show, I promise. Pete Alonso, on and on. The rest of the market, his role could be pushed out. Depending on how active the Mets are at the top of this market, his role could remain wide open, opening a return for him. So this is more fluid than most guys on this list. JD Martinez, Joe, served a purpose. Thought he was a great presence in this clubhouse. Sometimes eventually the wheels just fall off the bus. It happens to everybody. Age catches up to you. I thought this was a good signing. All in all, it worked out and gave the Mets a punch when they needed it. But at the end of the day, Martinez just couldn't hit by the end of the season, and I think Father Time has got him.
Agreed. Right time to sign him, right team to sign him for. I think he was a big help to guys like Mark Vientos throughout the season as kind of a third hitting coach, essentially, because the Mets have two hitting coaches. But as the season wore on, you saw the bat speed slowed down. He really struggled. He chased seemingly every single breaking ball off the plate. He was swinging at it. To your point, I don't know if Father Time has caught up to the point where his career's done, but I think at this point, the Mets could say, thank you for your 1 year here. It was helpful. Time to move on and figure out DH otherwise.
And I'll say this about JD Martinez. When he does call it a career, if he wants to be involved in baseball as a coach, player development, whatever it is, I think he'd be really, really good at it. How about both Luis Torrens and Jose Iglesias, Joe? Because they kind of came to the team around a similar time frame. They each had moments early on. Iglesias, it just never stopped really until the playoffs. He was one of the stories of the season. These two veterans, to me, Joe, feel like necessary depth to bring back. I like Torrens' defense behind the plate to spell Alvarez. And Iglesias, not only his chemistry with the team, but he's a good defensive replacement with speed, even at his age.
Torrens is arbitration eligible, so you're going to tender him. It'll be around $1 million is what he's projected. Done. So that's easy. Luis Torrens back as the backup catcher. Iglesias gets to be a little bit of a complicated discussion. What are his expectations going into this offseason? He obviously had a fantastic year for the Mets this year. The Mets don't get to where they got to without Jose Iglesias being a part of this ball club. Is he okay signing back for a year, getting a few $1 million, and being a backup infielder? Because that's what, to me, it has to be. I'm not signing Jose Iglesias back to be the Mets' second baseman in 2025.
No.
if he's content to come back in kind of the role that he was called up to do, which was be a backup infielder, I'm perfectly fine, bringing him back for 3 million, 4 million, wherever the case may be. But if his expectation, honestly, rightfully changed, that he's an everyday player in this league and he wants to try to get a 2-year deal somewhere or just get a starting commitment from somebody on a 1-year deal, I wouldn't blame him. If I'm the Mets, it's, we love you. We would love to have you back if you're willing to be a utility infielder, because we got Jeff McNeil still under contract, Luis Angel Acuna. You got guys like Ronnie Mauricio coming back and Jet Williams coming through the pike. Iglesias is very role dependent for me.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, is that, there might be a team out there that views him as, hey, come here, we'll give you, I don't know, $5 million and you're going to be our everyday second baseman, where the Mets might be like, hey, we'll find a way to make the money work, but we got young players in the pipeline and it's just not that simple. So it's a matter of what he wants. There's a world where Jose Iglesias might love it here, and he's, let's call it what it is, he's legitimately a budding pop star. And that matters in New York City, by the way. I know there's a lot of people probably laughing right now, but this is a guy that has already made a lot of money off his music career, and the promotion of it with the Mets was a massive part of that. So it's oddly enough very convoluted for a player that's not a superstar, but it'll be an interesting storyline to follow. And maybe that's one that gets done early, or maybe it's one that there's expanded conversations. All right, some of the pitching here, Joe. Paul Blackburn, we know he's got about a 4 to 5 month recovery ahead of him that'll get him ready for about halfway through spring training. After trading for Blackburn, Joe, this just feels like a guy that you tender and keep as pitching depth within your organization, right? It's that simple.
We're going to talk about how expensive pitching is on the market, and Paul Blackburn at $4 to $4.5 million. I don't care if he doesn't come back until the end of March back into game action, and then he has to, start in the minor leagues and build up. You need a army of pitching to get through a season. Unless the Mets think this back is just done and he'll never pitch again, you just tender him at $4.5 million. And if he reports to spring training and you don't want to, see through the season, you have until a certain date in March where you could cut him and you get a percentage of the money back from the arbitration number. So to me, Paul Blackburn, easy tender.
Yeah, easy tender. A guy that from 2022 and 2023, those seasons combined, he started 41 games and had a 4.35 ERA. I mean, if that's your number 7 or 6 guy, you're living really, really well. And I think he's a big part of the Mets pitching depth plans. And we always say on this show, almost to a point of being annoying, look at your starting pitchers at 6, 7, 8, and even 9, and they'll probably all be making an appearance before July. That's just the reality of injuries in this league. The Dodgers have equipped themselves to survive it, and they're, 1 game away from winning the World Series, and they had a lot of injuries this year. All right, let's continue on with the pitching and look at the bullpen here. Phil Maton, Joe, for fans that aren't aware, the Mets actually do have team control here, but it would be north of $7 million, which makes it more likely they let Maton go to free agency rather than picking up that option.
At $7.75 million, I just can't see the Mets picking that option up. Maton was very good for the Mets in the regular season. And, we talked with our producer, Jeff, before we started this record about kind of the biases that fall into our head during the postseason where Maton struggled. There's no way around it.
He was out of gas.
He ran out of gas. It just wasn't there in the postseason. He was good in the regular season, but I don't need to pay him almost $8 million. I could decline the team option, and maybe it's something that as the offseason progresses, if his price comes down, kind of like an Adam Ottavino from a year ago, where I believe it was a declined option, or he declined an offer and then he ended up coming back for less money later in the offseason. Maybe something like that can happen with Maton.
So following him, another acquisition and former Houston Astro here, Ryan Stanek. Joe, Stanek, back to your point, but the inverse of it, how quickly we forget Phil Maton was a regular season hero down the stretch that ran out of gas, probably got burned out before the postseason. Stanek had an ERA over 6 with the Mets during the regular season. I'd put him near my Mount Rushmore of Mets playoff heroes, at least in consideration of it. Stanek didn't allow an earned run in 2 appearances in the wild card round. He was really good in 2 appearances against the Phillies. And then he was just okay against the Dodgers. But I mean, the reality was it felt like every pitcher was out of gas. Stanek is one of the better postseason relievers of the last half decade of baseball history. For those that don't know, not only with the Marlins, but after that, obviously a long tenure with the Astros. Joe, I'd like to see Stanek back with this team. We don't say that about relievers very often, but I think the Mets need to kind of have the mindset of we're a playoff team next year. We need some proven arms for the playoffs that we feel like we can really trust in high leverage situations. I'd like Stanek back with this club.
We're going to get into the bullpen obviously as we continue through this show, but Stanek, to me, if I could have him back for what he signed for last year or a year, $4 million, $4.5 million, sign me up, bring him back. The Mets need some established relievers in this pen. And I know, as you said, the regular season didn't go so great, but I believe in Ryan Stanek's stuff profile. I think he would fit perfectly if you sign him with an eye towards him being a seventh inning type of guy rather than the eighth inning guy he ultimately ended up. I think that would be a good fit for this team.
Our last in-house reliever that's healthy right now, obviously Drew Smith and Brooks Raley are not. Adam Ottavino, Joe, it was kind of a surprise that they did the Ottavino encore in 2024. I don't see the double encore in 2025.
No, ultimately his year, like statistically, was just okay. It wasn't as awful, I think, as people kind of paint it to be. But the reality is it's time to move on from Adam Ottavino. And, thanks for your time, but time to find new relievers.
This is where it gets real interesting, Joe. The starting pitching. Quintana, Severino, and Manaea. I think we're going to have the combo of Severino and Manaea together. So let's have Quintana separately. This is somebody that he was looking like almost Carrasco status during the regular season at some points. And the Mets don't make it as far as they did without Quintana being an absolute hero during the playoffs.
Pitched two clinchers, right? He pitched the Milwaukee clincher and he pitched the Philadelphia clincher. Quintana stepped up when they needed it most. I just think at this point in time, entering his mid-30s, and we're going to talk about a handful of starting pitchers later in this show. I got notes on people. I wrote them down. I think it's time for, Quintana. I think he still has more in the gas in the bigs. I think the Mets should just look for maybe a little more potential in a pitcher like Quintana. I think you know what you're getting. He's a back end guy, and you could trust him to take the ball every time out. I think there's going to be opportunities to pursue higher upside with some other free agents than him.
If it's the end for Quintana as a Met, I'll say this. He was a damn good one. He made 44 starts in 2 years to a 3.7 ERA. He was somebody that, took the mound and was highly competitive and grinded through some starts. And I think when you showed someone that contract that he signed, that 2-year deal, if they read you those stats beforehand, you'd sign up for it. And that was the regular season. Obviously, how we'll remember Quintana is the story of what he did in this postseason, where he was marvelous, quite frankly, especially once again in the wild card in the divisional series, where he really, really stepped up. He pitched 11 innings across those series. He did not give up an earned run in 11 innings across 2 starts in those series. And then, everybody kind of fell apart against the powerhouse that was the Dodgers, so you don't hold that against him as much. Severino and Manaea, Joe. Let's break it down like this. Do you think this is an either or do you think there's a reality that, hey, these 1-year deals, I know Manaea has the option, it doesn't really count. These 1-year flyers was a Stearns masterclass. The Mets got everything they could have ever hoped for and more, and you kind of clap your hands and say, that's that? Or do you think that with the state of the Mets rotation, they'll have conversations with both and figure out, okay, one, who is actually likely to play out a multi-year deal and give us some value, and 2, or kind of the same mold, is any of this actually sustainable from both?
I think you have conversations with both of them. I think the expectation will be Sean Manaea will opt out and the Mets will make him the qualifying offer, which I assume he will decline. More interestingly, on the Severino side of things, do you make him a qualifying offer? He had a good season.
I do.
Obviously a rebound through a bunch of innings. The qualifying offer for this year is $21.05 million, so just over $21 million. Severino might just take that. Like, it wouldn't shock me if you made Luis Severino the qualifying offer and he took it. I think with his, lack of health historically, I think he will struggle on the market to get a long-term deal. Like, I don't think I'd be stunned if you saw Severino get a 4-year contract from somebody. It
like
might
a Marcus
cap at
Stroman kind of deal for Severino.
Like a 2 to 3 year kind of deal.
That's what
But
Stroman got, basically. Yeah.
But if you attach a qualifying offer to him, does that turn off some teams from going for him? Like
Yes.
that's a part of the system that I think baseball will work to fix in the next collective bargaining agreement, because Severino had a good year. And if the Mets make him a qualifying offer and he rightfully decides he wants a multi-year deal, he might struggle to find that on the market just because of what the teams are going to lose in order to sign him. So it'll be a decision the Mets have to make. I lean towards making him the qualifying offer and accepting the fact that he may just come back for 1 year and $21 million. And if he declines it, I'd still be willing to talk 2 years with Severino. I'm not opposed to him returning. Manaea, on the other hand, Connor, the more that I'm separating myself from what Sean Manaea did, the more questions I'm having about Sean Manaea going forward. And look, if the Mets sign him back, and David Stearns said basically explicitly at his press conference, there is mutual interest between the two in doing something. If I just gave you a blank resume, and sometimes when you're looking at free agents, you have to take that step back and look at it through that lens. It's a guy entering his age 33 season.
Right.
He threw the most innings he's ever thrown in his career, got up to 200 innings. And the arm angle change, there's two ways of looking at it, right? Positive. He made a change that made him a drastically better pitcher, and perhaps that's sustainable. On the other side of the coin, you ask, is it sustainable? Number one. And number two, from a health standpoint, how does changing what his body is accustomed to doing for so long drastically impact his ability to stay healthy into his mid-30s, coming off of throwing the most innings he's ever thrown in his life?
That's fair.
So it's a convoluted discussion. I think where I settle here with Manaea is I lean towards wanting to keep him, but it is a slight lean. Whereas if you asked me 3 weeks ago, it was you got to have Sean Manaea back unless it's an absurd contract. And contractual terms will matter here. I think if he finds 4 years on the market, I'm going to wish him well. But if I could keep him in the Chris Bassett range, that's kind of a contract comp that I've either said in our text or on the show or both. 3 years, $60 million, somewhere around there. I think you could talk me into doing that contract. But the further we remove ourselves from the emotions of Sean Manaea being the ace of this staff that led the Mets as far as he did in the postseason, the more I just kind of have a few questions that I think need to be answered.
Well, number one, I think you bring up one of the most important points of the entire offseason that so many gloss over, including myself, is that the Mets, especially your New York Mets in this era, the amount of resources and finances they have involved in sports science, nutrition, medicine, and physical therapy. They know more about these guys.
Absolutely.
To the point where whatever they do, I will think it was the right move after it's done. I don't even care if I sit here today, because I agree. Emotionally, I want Manaea back. I think he is incredible for the clubhouse. He takes the ball, awesome presence, felt like he loved it here. Easy guy to root for. One of my favorite players on the team. But why I say whatever the Mets do, I think will be the right decision is it's almost like we're sitting here, Joe, and everybody listening, and we have about 9 pieces of a 50-piece puzzle. The Mets have about 48, or maybe even 50 at this point with David Stearns. That's the difference when you're doing pitcher contracts and factoring in the physical projection of a guy. Because let's be real, in baseball, it's not like football where one guy could be 25 and he's running a 4.3, and on the first play, nobody touches him and he tears his ACL. Nobody could see that coming. In baseball, yeah, random things happen, but a lot of pitcher injuries are also wear and tear projected in this era. And I think you make a brilliant point that it's got to be a concern with both of these guys. Because Severino basically came out and said, like, thanks to the Mets medical sports science department, I was able to make all my starts this year. And he felt like he really credited them for that. So the Mets will know exactly what they're worth. And I always go back to, and now I think they're in an even better place, when they signed Senga. Senga was really a good value deal for what he was, because they knew that Senga did have some concerns medically over the long term. It worked out amazing in year one. It was an absolute disaster class in year two. But you can't even call it a disaster class because Senga's not paid $40 million a year. That's why you got him for what you got him for. So that's how it's going to work with Manaea and Severino. I love them back. Strategy-wise, I'm giving Severino the qualifying offer and it's cruel and it's a vicious part of the business, but I think it is a complete deterrent for other teams where even if he doesn't take your qualifying offer, it increases your odds of getting him back. So with Manaea, I don't think it'll be the same deterrent, but yeah, I think at the end of the day, the Mets kind of need one of these guys back if they are comfortable with the medical projection going forward for both. Man, that's a really difficult conversation, and we're going to learn a lot about how the Mets feel very shortly.
We're going to find out how ice cold they could be, right? Because this is year two of David. I mean, this is year two of David Stearns. Last offseason was a little easier. There wasn't much exiting the team of significance in free agency, unless am I forgetting somebody that was really significant that left as a free agent last offseason? Can't think of it, but we're about to find out. Yeah, we're going to find out kind of how ice cold they are and how much how does he balance the business and the emotional side of things, because there's a lot of emotions attached to Sean Manaea. I know a handful of Mets fans. Every single one of them wants Sean Manaea back in a Mets uniform, and I'm not opposed, but I'm just going to play the other side of the coin a little bit of there are questions. And to your point, if their sports science staff tells me they believe Sean Manaea is going to be fine for a 3-year, $60 million deal, I will say you're probably right.
Done. Absolutely. All right, you want to talk about emotions? You thought that one was hard. We got to talk about Pete Alonso. And we saved Pete Alonso for last, of course, for staying or going. Before we even have the combo, I want to get our first mailbag question in from Dale's Pale Ale, who always asks us good questions. In your opinion, does Pete's free agency feel more like Brandon Nimmo or Jacob deGrom? I think this is a really good spectrum to set here, Joe. I'll say Nimmo, and I'll explain why after you pick your side.
Yeah, I'm going to pick the Nimmo side. DeGrom felt very business-like. And
I never thought he even wanted to be here anymore, honestly.
Yeah, it felt so business-like. And then obviously after he signed with Texas, there was a lot of stuff came out after he signed with Texas. It was just like, oh, well, duh, he just didn't want to be in New York anymore. He wanted to go live and have a ranch and live his life. And
he's not a Northeastern kind of guy.
And he's the type of guy that when his baseball career is over, and he's even said this, like, he's just gone. You're just not going to hear from Jacob deGrom anymore.
You'll never see him.
Brandon Nimmo felt like a guy that
aren't going to retire his number, so you'll literally never see him.
I don't want to get into retired numbers. They retired
I
numbers. I
poked the bear on that.
They've retired numbers. I don't think they should have, and that's neither here nor there. Brandon Nimmo always felt like a guy that went to free agency because his contract expired, but he never actually wanted to leave. It was just a matter of going out to the market, seeing what the market presented to him, and then he went to the Mets and said, this is what it'll take and I'll stay. And they came to an agreement. And that feels to me a lot more like what the Pete Alonso situation is going to play out like. I do not think this is going to be fast. I think Pete Alonso's free agency is going to last deep into the offseason, whether that is the Scott Boras factor of trying to extract every dollar, whether that is teams seeing alternative options like Christian Walker, like Paul Goldschmidt, maybe Cody Bellinger as a first baseman if he opts out of his contract with the Cubs. Looking ahead to next offseason, teams do this. Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is a free agent next offseason. Yeah. So I think Pete's going to have a very interesting market, and I think it's going to take quite a bit of time. But I think at his core, he very much wants to stay a New York Met. And I think in their guts, the Mets would very much like Pete Alonso to stay with the New York Mets as well. It's just a matter of where does the number get to? Where does the length of contract get to. It's a difficult decision, and we talk about Manaea and Severino having some emotions to it. This is a whole nother level, and you're going to have to do, I think, quite a bit to ease the pain of Mets fans if Pete Alonso walks out that door.
Yeah, it is, man. It's tricky because the postseason made it even trickier. It felt like without the playoffs, we were inching towards.
If the Mets didn't make the playoffs, it was good riddance, is what the way fans. That's what I saw. Fans couldn't wait to kick him out the door.
It was about 90-10.
Yeah,
90-10. And you know what, though? To be fair, because I think, to be fair, and we're witnessing this in wild, wild action right now with Aaron Judge, and I won't even go down that road today. In New York, a lot of times you are judged fully on what you do in the postseason. And that's why we sit here right now. Francisco Lindor is the narrative of Lindor. It felt like Lindor had a rough start with the Mets. Then about 70% of the fan base really embraced him. And now he has 100% approval rating. So it's that's how quickly you could flip everything because he's a big time player. Pete, and I give Pete a lot of credit because I had my doubts about Pete going into the postseason with how lost he looked most of this year. And in big moments, runners on base. I mean, the numbers are the numbers. Like, they're all there, available on Baseball Reference. Pete had big hits in the postseason. Big time hits, big time at-bats. And I think it not only changed the view of Pete with the Mets fan during this free agency, but it also gave Pete a confidence that I feel better about him going into next year than I did without the postseason. And that's fair because those games had to be played for that to happen. So it does feel more Nimmo to me, where I think Pete isn't dying to get out the door. The beauty, and we say this often, one of the many beauties of Steve Cohen owning this team is that if the Mets want to keep someone and the player wants to stay, the Mets always have the power to make the highest offer at the end of the day. Some guys just leave, right? Like, some guys are like, I'm not calling the Mets. I'm not having my agent call the Mets again. I'm out of here. DeGrom's a perfect example of a guy that clearly just did not want to be here anymore. But I don't get that vibe from Pete. I think Pete wants to be in all the record books for a lot of the power categories for the Mets. I think Pete wants to win a World Series here. Pete is very involved with the Tunnel to Towers organization and a lot of different charities that are New York based. So, and I think Pete is probably looking around and going, man, I've seen this organization really flip a script under Steve Cohen. Like, things are pretty good here. The grass isn't always greener on the other side. So Pete's free agency, I think a lot of us want him back. That's no secret. It's all about the kind of price and the years.
Right.
If Pete Alonso can go get a 6 or 7 year deal out there at a big number in the first base market, power to you, Pete. Like, these deals don't age well at his age and position being a right-handed bat. But if they can find the common ground and Pete's market isn't that hot, and spoiler alert, I could be wrong about this because it only takes one team, Joe. I don't think Pete's going to be this dynamic free agent that has 7 teams calling him with these 6 to 7 year offers of $35 million a year. I just don't see it being that kind of situation. So all in all, my gut is we're inching towards Pete being back, and this kind of going full circle where it rounds into a fair contract for both sides, rather than when it felt like Pete was unreasonable for a long time. Then it felt like the Mets shouldn't even be interested in bringing him back. And now everybody just goes back to the middle and go, yeah, let's make you a Met for life and not at an absolute team-killing price.
I could see it being like one more year more than you're probably comfortable with. Something like one of those things where they agree on like the general like AAV of what he should make on a per year basis. And and Pete's side goes, give us one more year and you'll do it. And Steve Cohen just goes, I don't care about 2030. Let's just add one more year to the contract. I think Pete Alonso will be back with the Mets. I think it's going to be a long and arduous process. I think we're going to hear a lot of rumors of, as Scott Boras tends to do, of how many teams love Pete Alonso and want to make him the highest paid first baseman ever. And longest and everything comes with the territory. I think this probably won't settle until after the new year, but I do think, and that's my gut as we record here on October 29th, is that Pete Alonso will sign a long-term deal with the Mets. And, maybe it's 6 years. 5 feels like the number that makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. So that means you probably have to go to 6 to get it done.
5 would be Dynamite. I agree. 6 is too long, but that's how the game goes in free agency. I do think Soto signs before Pete, Joe.
Oh, yeah.
Mets are not. Like, I'm not saying Mets are just Mets. I'm saying anywhere.
I don't think Soto's market's going to be an incredibly long one.
There's not a lot of teams.
How many teams are possibly involved on this? And we'll get more into Soto in a minute, but how many teams can possibly be in on that?
Let's be quick on this one. The coaching staff, stay or go. Do you expect any movement with this group? I feel like the Mets kind of like the consistency they have right now.
I can't think of a coach that I don't want back. I think everyone did a good job. The only thing that I guess you consider is there a team that's hiring a new manager here in the coming weeks? Do they want to offer Jeremy Barnes the hitting coach job instead of being the assistant hitting coach that he is here? But I can't think of a coach that I wouldn't want back. I'm good with the staff. I thought they generally did a really good job this year.
Yeah, and they've held on to Jeremy Hefner throughout different regimes.
Keep holding on to Jeremy Hefner. He's one of the best pitching coaches in baseball.
Without a doubt. So that decision has been really smart for the Mets to keep him here, even throughout some turnover over the years. How about this mailbag question from Alan Pritchard, 7593 on YouTube? Do you guys think the time has come for a steady six-man rotation? In 2024, Senga gets hurt after pitching once a week in Japan. Manaea hits a wall in the NLCS. Severino pitched more innings in 1 year than the last 3 combined. Also, the expanded playoffs means it's so much harder to have fresh arms at the end. I wonder if the six-man rotation is an idea whose time has come. I mean, Joe, we've touched on this before. We know the Dodgers are going to be living in a world where that's a thing for them with not only Yamamoto, but Ohtani as well. I think the point about the playoffs is key. There's no denying Sean Manaea just hit a wall. Sean Manaea didn't stink against the Dodgers. He was physically worn down to the bottom. So the plan for the Mets now, to me, and this is dangerous to get this way, but the plan for the Mets can't just be, how do we empty the tank to make the playoffs? The plan for the Mets needs to be, how do we make the playoffs, but we are a little conservative with the gas tank and have guys ready to throw a lot in the postseason? Six-man rotation is one of the ways you do it, but you got to have 6 arms to actually do that, Joe. Easier said than done.
We have talked on this show for at least a couple years about six-man rotation, I think, being the future of the sport. And if you want to go back to, I don't know, when did we talk to David Stearns on this show? Whenever we talk, find that episode on YouTube or in your podcast feed. Yeah. I asked David Stearns straight up about six-man rotation being not just a thing because of the existence of Kodai Senga, but for it just to be a part of the sport. And, he more or less said, paraphrasing here, like, it's a discussion we have very often. The roster limits make it a little complicated because you can only carry so many pitchers. So thus you're kind of down a reliever versus other teams in the sport. But this is where I think baseball is eventually headed. I think the roster limits will probably change at some point in time. All you have to do is look how the world operates. In Japan, they pitch once a week. In college baseball, which is the feeder system to Major League Baseball, they pitch once a week. In the minors, pitchers rarely pitch twice in a week. It's usually 5 to 6 days rest. Why on earth would Major League Baseball have a 5-man rotation? I know that's just the way it's been done, right? And the bigger picture question here about the 6-man rotation is, how does this impact pitcher pay? We're talking about paying Sean Manaea $20 to $23 million a year. You're talking about offering Luis Severino $21 million for a qualifying offer. And, we'll get into some free agent arms that are going to cost a heck of a lot more than that. In a time where starting pitching is seemingly being devalued in every sense of the word, you go to a 6-man rotation, how can you justify paying a frontline starter a lot of money when you're taking the ball out of his hands?
That's fair.
But it is better for everybody. If you go look at most pitchers, go just think of a pitcher off the top of your head, look them up on Baseball Reference. I'm willing to bet 3 out of 4 of them have better numbers on 5 days rest than 4 days rest. It's better for everybody. It's the way I think the game is headed. I just think the current roster limits that MLB has makes it harder for teams to do it. but we are getting to the point, I think it's not far away. 6-man rotations will be a normal thing. And with Kodai Senga being a member of this Mets team, the 6-man rotation has to be, if not full-time in 2025, a high percentage of the time, depending on off days and things like that, where you maybe can avoid it. That's where we're going.
Right. It's a conversation where there's just so many road maps, right? Because
Yeah.
you nailed it perfectly where it's, you'd love to do this, but then why are you paying one guy $50 million a year in the future to be your frontline guy? I guess the thought is we could try to pitch him twice in our 2 biggest playoff series of the year.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's the thought with the Yankees and Garrett Cole right now. And the other side of that is, 1, that guy has to actually live up to the expectations. And 2, you need people after him because the games all count at the same. You get 1 win for each game or 1 loss for each game. So,
and you got to score. That might
you
help.
have to hit. So it's team sport, and you need to actually have relievers that can come in and slam the door. So it's a really good question, and I think there's a world where we're trending that way. But I remember in that conversation we had with Stearns, part of his response was specifically, you also need to have the arms to do it. And everybody is in a race right now trying to figure out how to have volume. They are really looking at quantity, even to the point of over quality in a rotation right now, because, man, at the end of the day, it's a long marathon, the baseball season. But if it keeps guys healthier, then maybe there's a thought process of, we needed 6 starters, but now we had less injuries to these starters compared to when there was 5. And now we're going to our 8th and 9th and 10th starting pitcher where we had the 6-man rotation. Okay, the 7th and 8th guy had to pitch a couple times, but we kept our overall injuries down. There's a lot of different things going on there.
Yeah.
All right, let's briefly go down on the farm. We're never going to stop that. We're going to kick this off with 2 mailbag questions because this does affect next year and potential offseason decision-making. So this is down on the farm, offseason related. Will Clayton on YouTube asked, how deep is the Mets stock of pitching prospects? Will we be seeing any of them on next year's team, Joe?
It is getting deeper and deeper, seemingly by the day. The work that has been done under Eric Jagers and as the vice president of pitching, and Andy Green obviously overseeing player development as a whole, the 2024 season from a development standpoint was a huge win on the pitching side of things, whether that is Brandon Sproat emerging as one of the very best prospects in the Mets system, whether that is Nolan McLean progressing throughout a professional season where he tried the 2-way thing, gave that up, and he started to pitch much better down the stretch. Whether that's a Jonah Tong, who came from a guy I was familiar with, of course, from when the Mets drafted him. And, I remember us having Tommy Tanis on the show and talking about, Jonah Tong as kind of like just a project. And now the project has come together and looks the parts of a serious pitching prospect. They have Blade Tidwell and Mike Vassell and Dom Hamill, who all had, let's call it up and down seasons at the AAA level. There were times where things were good for them and times when it wasn't. The AAA environment is difficult, no question, with a different baseball, a different strike zone. It's just, those are offensive leagues by nature. So you really have to dive into the stuff of those guys. But when you look for 2025, where the Mets are obviously going to need to add multiple veteran starting pitchers, and we'll get into some of those options, having guys like Sproat, Tidwell, Hamill, and Vassell all in the AAA Syracuse rotation, while having McLean and Tong, amongst others, in the AA rotation, you're getting to the point where the depth that eventually you'll be calling on won't be, no offense, Joey Lucchesi, no offense, the other kind of 4A, I hate using that term because it's not a real thing, but 4A type of arms. You're now going to have the potential to call upon young guys with maybe some more exciting stuff. So things are headed in a very positive direction on the pitching side of things for the Mets.
This one from CFGGFRT, a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you for that. Who do you expect to come up from the minors? Example, Jet Williams. Joe, I think Drew Gilbert will factor into some needed outfield depth, right?
Drew Gilbert should factor in. I think he's a guy that, we said it on last week's show, had he not gotten injured, we probably would have seen Drew Gilbert by the the middle of 2024, and he probably would have been the center fielder in the playoffs with the Mets there. So I don't think the Mets should head into 2025 with the idea that Drew Gilbert is their center fielder on opening day by any means. I would be looking to do a Harrison Bader-ish move. Find somebody, a 1-year stopgap that when and if Drew Gilbert is ready, he could take over and run away with the center field job. But between Gilbert and all those pitchers, and Luis Angel Acuna could have more of a role. Jet Williams got to AAA at the end of the season. He's performing at the Arizona Fall League. I'm not sure if he's going to start in AAA or not. They may send him back to AA. I think they just sent him to AAA just to get more at bats because the AA season ended and AAA season goes longer than that. But Jet is going to be my number one prospect again. I'm working on a prospect update kind of to just refresh it heading into the offseason, because I think we have some trades that are going to be coming this offseason when I heard David Stearns talking his media availability. So I'll have an updated list for you, and Jet will be at the top of it still, and he's not incredibly far away.
You're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your pods. Speaking of those trade ideas, Joe, let's jump right into that before we get into free agency. Is there any trade candidates, and you've texted me some already, any trade ideas that you have in mind? Because I think this is the hardest thing to do as a podcaster during the baseball offseason. 9 out of 10 times, the trades that happened during the MLB offseason were very hard to project or pick. It's not as cut and dried as other leagues, the NBA, the NFL, even the NHL, where, yes, you could look at guys that are on expiring deals, but it's still not as common. I think we knew Juan Soto would be moved last year because he was a guy that just did not want to ever sign an extension before his first deal was up, before his arbitration was up. Do you have any trade ideas for our beloved New York Mets?
I got a few trade ideas.
All right,
and
let's go.
To your point, Connor, you don't know that who's available and if deals will actually get done. But I listened to David Stearns speak, and when they asked him about the trade market, he had his little smile and laugh. He's like, I like operating in the trade market. I have a feeling this is going to be the winter where David Stearns and the Mets make a big trade. I think when we look at the starting pitching, and we're going to get into some free agent options, I don't know if I want to play with any of the top of the market free agent starters. And I'll get into why certainly when we get to that point. Garrett Crochet from the White Sox is going to be available again. And is that a guy that David Stearns and the Mets can go after? A potential frontline pitcher who was obviously fantastic for the White Sox this year. The most important thing, he's got this year and next year of team control. So he has 2 years of control. He's projected $3 million this year. When we're putting together this pie of this Mets team, and we're going to get into Juan Soto here in a minute, right? And you want to talk him. You want to talk Pete Alonso. You want to talk keeping Luis Severino or Sean Manaea, and these guys, you're talking about $50 million, $25 million, $20 million. As much money has come off the books, you're quickly going to go through that money if everything is a high dollar move. The White Sox are a team that, under Chris Getz, their general manager thus far, the deals he has made have been mostly quantity deals, not so much the trading a guy for one top item. It's let me get a plethora of options. Yeah, they don't have players. So could they be a fit? And I'm not, rushing anyone out the door, but could Brett Beatty and Luis Angel Acuna be starters for the White Sox on opening day? And then you throw in a couple other prospects and boom, you got Garrett Crochet. Or can you take Andrew Benintendi's money on and get Garrett Crochet for less? Like, that's something that Steve Cohen can look into. But my kind of bold take is I think the biggest starting pitcher that the Mets add this offseason will be via trade, not via free agency. And I think Crochet kind of tops that list.
He has to, right? I mean,
yeah,
he's a star when he's on the mound. He's got big time stuff. He struck out over 12, over 9 last year, all-star, 6'6", 240 pounds, big guy on the mound, has some power pitching. That would be a splash. If the Mets got Crochet, or really any frontline starter, that has team control left, that would be a real big time move. I know another one that you texted me that I thought was really interesting. It's a much smaller degree, but we've seen Stearns operate in that. Let's not forget, he traded for Tyrone Taylor Adrian Hauser was the guy talked about in that deal, but Tyrone Taylor ended up being the impact player of that deal. You brought up Cedric Mullins as an interesting player, Joe. We've had the conversation about center field before, how we're not looking for this long-term 4 to 5 year deal out there for a center fielder. Or when you look at Mullins, he's a guy that he's got one more year of arbitration, and then he's a free agent in 2026. He's 30 years old. He's somebody that he misses time here and there. He's also was healthy all 2021, 2022. So that's happened. He played 147 games this year, to be fair to Mullins. But he's someone, as the Orioles just have never-ending prospect talent, I would be floored if they give Mullins a deal that goes after 2025. This is it for Mullins. Maybe they feel like they can get something back for him right now. I really liked when you brought this name up to me as a stopgap in center field.
He's projected in a neighborhood of 8.6, 8.7 million for 2025. And with Colton Cowser and Heston Kierstad and all these young outfielders coming through the Orioles system, they were considering trading Cedric Mullins at the deadline. And that's kind of what spurred the idea. Heck, they were in first place in the American League East and they were considering trading this guy. Maybe they'll consider trading him in the winter. And he had a tough first half. And as a fantasy baseball owner of Cedric Mullins, I felt that poor first half that he had. But he had a fantastic second half, posted in OPS over 800. And the key here is he is a plus defensive outfielder.
Yes.
He is a plus base runner. He stole over 30 bases this year.
In 3 of the last 4 years.
Yeah. So he's the guy that I think fits that mold of what I was just talking about, where they need that stopgap. As good as Tyrone Taylor was for his team down the stretch, I think it would be a bit of a missed opportunity if the Mets went into opening day 2025 and told me Tyrone Taylor was the starting center fielder. I think he's a better fourth outfielder. And there's nothing wrong with that because they're going to play a heck of a lot of innings. And if we're going to pursue a certain New York right fielder in free agency for lots and lots of dollars, who may not be the best defensive right fielder in the world, it's pretty important to have defense in center field. So if I could get my hands on Cedric Mullins, and I can't guess necessarily what that would cost, I would think Baltimore would look for something from your pitching side of things in the farm system. They have so many offensive players coming and they could use more pitching. Maybe you could trade, I don't want to speculate a person, but somebody there. I think Mullins is a really good fit for this team.
Yeah, I agree with you. He's interesting. Like I said, 30 plus steals, 3 of the last 4 years. Most importantly, the defense in center field, veteran presence, lefty bat. Lefty bat would be nice to have as that center field option. So you brought up the fact that part of the idea is needing plus defense in center field is that your right fielder might be mediocre in right field. And if every Mets fan gets their dream, that right fielder will be one of the best players in all baseball, and it's Juan Soto. This conversation, Joe, is going to eat up a portion of every podcast we do until he is either with the Mets or back with the Yankees or somewhere else. But we have to have it partially today. Soto is just fascinating, Joe, because it's hard to even find a marker of where this money ends up, because it's just not often somebody that I think just turned 26. I'm pretty sure with Juan Soto.
Game 1 of the World Series was his 26th birthday.
Juan Soto turned 26 years old a few days ago. He will hit free agency. He is one of the best offensive players in the entire sport and on a historic pace offensively. And it's not just power, but the ability to get on base. I mean, these opportunities just don't happen very often in the sport, Joey, when you have a free agent like this. And to even enhance this conversation, something you said before we were recording is not a lot of teams can even get a phone call, because Juan Soto is going to command, I think, north of $600 million. I know a lot of people are throwing around 500 as the starter. I think this deal ends up north of $600 million. That to me says the New York Mets, the New York Yankees, if the Dodgers want to get involved, of course, the Dodgers can always get involved. Maybe there's a mystery fourth team, but
People
man,
speculate the Blue Jays because they were hot on the trails of Shohei Ohtani and willing
but
to
they
offer
never
him a
pay
lot of
any of
money.
their own players. So, and
Yeah,
here's the trickle effect of that. If the Blue Jays pay Juan Soto, are they not paying Vlad Guerrero Jr.? Because I'll
yeah,
call and trade for
probably.
Vlad Guerrero Jr. if the Mets don't get Soto. So there. Anyways, we'll keep it Soto
Yeah.
for now. This is going to be. We dreamt of the Ohtani chase being really fun and exciting as a baseball fan, and Ohtani chose to not have that be a part of it at all. The Soto chase will have all the bells and whistles under Scott Boras.
It's going to be fun, stressful, exciting, nerve-wracking, because I'm going to say this, and if you've listened to this show as long as we've done it, and when we did a show before we were with SNY, or if you follow me on Twitter, you know I am not ever all in on anything. I find reservations about everything under the sun. There is not going to be another free agent like Juan Soto in the 2020s. There is not going to be another like Juan Soto for some time. You know, obviously Aaron Judge a couple years ago, but that was he was just signing with the Yankees.
When he wasn't 26.
Yeah, and he wasn't 26. Shohei Ohtani a year ago didn't really want to do anything, but age 30. This is the one of free agents. Like the best offensive comparable for Juan Soto is Ted Williams.
It's not hyperbole.
No, this is the free agent. This is what you save your money for. This is what you plan your payroll around. This is what the Dodgers did 2 years ago when they signed nobody in free agency other than keeping JD Martinez around so they have a clear book the next year to give Shohei Ohtani whatever was necessary to bring him in. And lucky for them, he did them a rock solid favor with the deferring the whole contract essentially, and that allowed them to get Yamamoto and Tyler Glasnow as well. To me, the cost doesn't exist that I would not give Juan Soto. And obviously there's like a semblance of realism in it. I'm not saying you give Juan Soto $2 billion. Like within the confines of the market, I don't care what it costs. And where I think this is headed, Connor, I think it certainly starts at 6. I think what Scott Boras and Juan Soto's goal is going to be in free agency is to get either A, the highest AAV in the history of the sport, B, the highest total value in the history of the sport, or C, both of the above. So it's going to be fascinating to see where it goes. And as you said, very few teams involved. To me, this is what Steve Cohen is here for. He has the opportunity to sign a pillar player. Like his money has done so much for this organization at the infrastructure level, at the player development level, at the scouting level, at the sports science level, and on the field. At the end of the day, the Mets have made the playoffs 2 out of the last 3 years. It was kind of sandwiched around a really disappointing bad season, but they've had some semblance of success here, and a lot of it is due to the financial backing of Steve Cohen. Now's the time. This is the player to do everything you can to make sure he is a New York Met. And if it costs me $650 million, it's not my money. So sorry, Steve, do it. If it's gonna get closer to 7, do it. What's the difference? If you're willing to go 650, what the heck is the difference between 650 and 7 over 13 years? That's like, I don't know what, $2 million a year? Who cares? Make Juan Soto a Met.
I'm with you all the way. Listen, there's no argument from me. This is the one right here. And we got not our hopes up, but we were very in on the Yamamoto sweepstakes last year. A large part because the Mets were so bad in August. We needed to hold on to something and look forward to something. The Mets were so good this year that it was nice to park this off to the side for a few months. But the reality is this is the biggest move the Mets can make. And the tier between the next one is not even in the same stratosphere. I was trying to think of a comparable situation for this, Joe, and it's been very difficult because, yeah, Ohtani with the money, but Ohtani, number one, the thought of Ohtani when he was signing is that he also pitches. He wasn't a young free agent. He wasn't old, but he was a typical.
He was 30.
He's 30. Judge, once again, I mean, this is as big to me, Joe, and we were young when this happened. when A-Rod signed with the Texas
Mm-hmm.
Rangers in 2000, that was after the 2000 season, because A-Rod was 25 in his first season with the Rangers. And A-Rod was coming off a season where he had an OPS over 1,000 with the Mariners. He had another season a couple years before that over 1,000. I mean, he was out of this world. He even had a 46 stolen base season while hitting over 40 home runs. Like A-Rod was this 25-year-old unicorn free agent. And he was only with the Rangers for 3 years, but he hit 52, 57, and 47 home runs. He was unbelievable, like unbelievable. And Soto doesn't have the same power, although he has really good power. He doesn't have the power A-Rod had, but Soto is better at getting on base. And these things just don't happen. I mean, I'm going back to the offseason of 2000, Joe.
Yeah.
That's what I'm looking at. It's 2024.
25 years, essentially.
Years later. And I'm sure somebody will mention some, other times. But this is the one in terms of the player, like the impact of the player relative to age, where the contract, you are getting so much from this contract for at least the first half decade, and probably much longer, but at least the first half decade.
The first half decade is Juan Soto's prime.
Right, going into it.
He's entering his prime theoretically. Like, obviously he's been in the league for so long that maybe the timeline shifts a little bit, whatever. But from a normal just development standpoint, Juan Soto is not quite in his prime yet.
Right. So all that to say, that's just the baseball aspect of what it would do for the New York Mets, which is why we're here. There is an absolute New York side to this that nobody can run or hide from. And it's not us sitting here and because this, who knows? He could go back to the Yankees very easily. There's no one sitting here. We're very well aware of that. But man, that is a wild scenario to think about, that the New York Mets are going to be in on the best player on the Yankees, by the way. Like, I know that's a recency bias because of Judge's postseason, but if you asked every Yankee fan, who would you rather have next year, you could only pick one. It feels like right now they are very not pleased with Aaron Judge.
Now's a bad time to ask that question.
Now's a bad time to ask the question. It's almost unfair. And it could change. Yeah. Maybe Judge hits 4 home runs in the next, couple days. But the point is, Joe, this also is a New York story. And that is another aspect of it that makes it so incredibly fascinating. You and I stand together in this, that we think Steve Cohen will not have a limit on this one. I thought the reason they stopped with Yamamoto is because Yamamoto was never coming here. Yamamoto was going to the Dodgers, and the New York baseball franchises figured that out, and that was that. They never were in on Judge. They never were. It was almost a favor to the Yankees. This is the one. You said it perfectly before we did the show. You almost called it the David Stearns of players, where Cohen was eyeing Stearns for so long, and it feels like the Mets have had their eyes on Soto for a long time as well.
I truly believe in. I don't believe in coincidences. Like, I think they have eyed this for years, and the payroll was set up with the short-term kind of mercenary contracts with Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander, and Starling Marte at 4 years wasn't even particularly long-term, but it felt like a lot of short-term investments to keep the payroll books open. Because imagine the Mets just signed, this top free agent and that top free agent, and gave Blake Snell a long-term contract last year, and signed Yamamoto, and all these things that they kind of passed over and got criticized for. It is all forgiven if they sign Juan Soto. This is to me what it is all been for. And the New York aspect is great. I agree, Connor, that the lack of Aaron Judge pursuit was, partially, I think you knew that he wanted to go back to the Yankees, but also, like, we're not here to get in the way of your franchise player. Juan Soto is not the Yankees franchise player. Juan Soto has been a Yankee for 10 months. He had a fantastic year. I'm sure he enjoyed himself, and there is a very real possibility he wants to stay and stays with the Yankees. I'm not here to tell anyone that is not a possibility. But this is not the one that you sit out and let the Yankees just kind of have their guy back. This is the one where you make your statement as the Mets. This is the statement free agent move. Lindor was a statement trade move, in the first year of his ownership. The Mets have a lot of good players on this team. We could run down this roster. Brandon Nimmo is a good player. Mark Vientos is a good player. Francisco Alvarez is a good player. The Mets have one pillar on their team, and it's Francisco Lindor. And one pillar cannot hold up a house. So the Mets need multiple pillars. They need certainly one more. And that one, the one is Juan Soto.
The dream of us predicting the lineup and writing in Lindor, Soto, Vientos. And maybe
Alonso.
even Pete. And maybe even Pete still. I think they are, not tied together, Pete and Soto, or whatever that's worth. I know a lot of people are thinking they are. I don't think they are, by the way. I think they're totally different conversations. So, and we're going to continue to have those conversations. Hopefully everybody enjoyed this long off-season preview for the Mets pod as we continue that for the next couple months. This is the Mets pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. Remember to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review with a question, and we'll look for it for a future mailbag. And, of course, you can watch the show on SNY's YouTube channel. Every episode's there, so become a subscriber over there as well. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.
Next week, I will get into all of my starting pitching notes that I have here. We just talked so long that we'll get into that next week, so trust us, everybody.